Welcome to Sci-Fi Quantum Archives. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and explore. Princeton, 1955. A room heavy with the scent of books, ink, and the slow decay of time. A single lamp hums, its glow barely reaching the edges of a cluttered desk. Papers lie scattered, equations half-written, thoughts abandoned mid-sentence. A man sits there, shoulders hunched, pen trembling between fingers that once commanded the language of the universe itself. The world outside still believes he is merely an old physicist, a relic from a golden age of discovery. But inside these walls, a war is being fought, against time, against knowledge, against the thing clawing at the edge of his understanding. The pen moves. A final equation. Not meant for textbooks, not meant for students, not even meant for those who would come after him. This is different. Every stroke of ink across the paper tightens something in his chest, and not just from the weight of age. It is the weight of knowing. The numbers refuse to lie. The proof is there, undeniable, unrelenting, staring back at him with a quiet, horrifying patience. He stops. Looks at what he has done. Hands press against the table, knuckles whitening as if to steady himself against a reality that has just shifted beneath him. His breath is shallow. Something about seeing it, fully formed, complete, makes it real in a way the pieces never were. There is no satisfaction in the solution. No triumph in the discovery. Only the kind of silence that follows an irreversible mistake. A rustle of fabric. The door behind him remains closed, but it doesn't matter. He isn't expecting anyone. The world can never see this. No one can. His fingers move with a frantic purpose, folding the paper, sealing it inside an envelope as if that alone could contain what he has unleashed. But where does one send a message that should never be read? Not to a colleague. Not to a university. No institution on earth is prepared for this. His eyes flick to another document, one most people have forgotten even exists, a letterhead that does not officially belong to any government, any agency, any nation. It is a place that, by design, does not exist. And yet, it has always been watching. The pen is heavy as he scrawls the address, the ink barely dry before his trembling hand presses a seal over it. He hesitates, the faintest of hesitations. Not because he doubts his conclusion, no, that part is irrefutable, but because this is an act that cannot be undone. A sigh escapes, barely more than a whisper. The weight settles over his shoulders again, heavier this time. A man who had once redefined reality itself is now left with a singular, inescapable thought. The universe was never supposed to reach this moment. The envelope disappears into the folds of his coat. He stands, his steps slow, deliberate. The world outside continues as it always has. The sun still rises. The rivers still flow. People wake, work, love, sleep. None of them know that the clock has already started ticking. The box arrived without ceremony. No warnings. No stamps to mark its significance. Just a plain, aged container, the kind that had passed through too many hands, too many years, collecting the weight of time itself. It shouldn't have been here. Not in this facility. Not on this desk. Not addressed to someone who was never meant to find it. The label was brittle, its ink faded to a whisper. But the name, his name, was there. It had been waiting. A lifetime spent in research, dissecting the edges of knowledge, had taught one truth above all others. Truly dangerous discoveries do not announce themselves. They do not come wrapped in urgency, delivered with warnings and flashing lights. They arrive like this, quiet, unassuming, patient. Because whatever waits inside does not need spectacle. It already knows it will be read. Gloved hands pried open the lid, careful, reverent. Inside, files yellowed by decades exhaled the scent of old paper and something harder to name. A presence, maybe. The weight of an intention left unfinished. The records bore no official seal, no institution's insignia. Only a single sheet sat atop the pile, handwritten, uneven, the strokes sharp from an unsteady hand. A letter. Einstein's final letter. Fingers hovered before touching it. This was not supposed to exist. No mention of it in archives. No record in classified vault. The man had written his last words to the world in carefully chosen statements, his farewell measured, deliberate. Yet here, unseen, unknown, was something else. Something meant for someone who was never meant to be him. The envelope was heavy, though the paper inside was thin. Ink bled through the creases, its pressure betraying the force behind the words. He had written this with urgency. No revisions. No careful restructuring of thoughts. Just a message that needed to be sent before something, before someone, could stop it. The seal cracked, the paper unfolded, and the breath in his lungs seemed to thin as the first words revealed themselves. There is something wrong with our understanding of time. It was not a philosophical musing. Not a man, at the end of his life, grasping at the unknowable. This was an equation. A proof. A conclusion written with the same confidence that had reshaped physics itself. The next lines, tighter, more forceful, drove deeper. It is not a constant. It is not a force. It is an equation that should have been incomplete. But it is not. The equations followed. Notations that should have been familiar, but the longer they were studied, the less they belonged. The logic bent in ways that didn't conform to anything written in the laws of physics. It wasn't just unfinished, it had been abandoned. Stopped at the precipice of something that could not be put into words. But there, beneath the final calculation, a last message stood alone. Do not let them complete it. The letter slipped from his grasp, settling onto the desk in silence. There were no additional instructions, no explanations, no attempt to contextualize the warning. Just an assertion, left in the scrawl of a man whose mind had once redefined reality itself. Outside the room, the world continued. Computers processed, colleagues worked, systems hummed, all moving within the boundaries of knowledge they assumed were secure. Yet in his hands, a forgotten message sat waiting. A warning. A plea. A conclusion too dangerous to finish. And in the hollow space between reason and understanding, one thought pressed forward. Who was he warning? The equations stretched across the page, familiar in structure, predictable at first glance. The curvature of spacetime, the relationship between mass and energy, the relentless flow of causality, everything expected, everything where it should be. Yet something lingered beneath the surface. A misalignment. A hesitation in the numbers like a heartbeat out of rhythm. The calculations unfolded with a precision that should have been comforting, but the deeper they were examined, the less they resembled anything that belonged to established physics. The logic was there, yet something refused to sit still, as if the numbers were resisting interpretation. Patterns emerged. Subtle at first. The kind easily dismissed as errors in notation or quirks of an unfinished draft. But dismissing them became impossible. They repeated, too deliberate, too structured to be coincidence. A symmetry that shouldn't be there. A constant shifting when constants were meant to hold. Numbers gave way to relationships, relationships to implications. And the implications, those were the problem. The universe was built on rules. Immutable laws governing everything from the way galaxies collided to the trajectory of a falling leaf. These equations should have reinforced that. They didn't. They suggested something else entirely. The relationships in the numbers were not describing reality. They were describing something beneath it. A system. A structure that should not exist, because fundamental laws were not meant to be built. They were meant to be. The realization struck slowly. Unease creeping in as the implications settled. The laws of physics were not natural. Not fixed. They weren't a fabric woven into existence but a construct, designed, applied, and, worst of all, maintained. The equation was incomplete, yet its trajectory was unmistakable. It did not predict the past, nor describe the present. It pointed forward. A model in motion, progressing toward a conclusion embedded within its very structure. There was an endpoint. A moment in which these laws, gravity, time, energy, motion, would cease to be. not shift, not evolve. A system with an expiration date. The numbers didn't say why. Didn't say who, if anyone, had set the parameters. But the pattern was undeniable. A countdown existed, buried inside the fundamental structure of the universe itself. And there was no equation beyond that point. No variables. No contingencies. No continuation. Nothing. The air in the room felt heavier, though nothing had changed. Reality had not altered, but understanding had. The weight of it pressed inward. The paper between trembling fingers held a thought so profound, so absolute, it reduced everything else to irrelevance. The mind that had once reshaped the way humanity understood existence had seen it, understood it, and stopped. Not because he lacked the ability to finish the work. Because he knew that no one should. The numbers changed before the realization set in. A minor deviation, so small it could have been dismissed, should have been dismissed. The kind of inconsistency that instruments produce when recalibrating, the kind of drift that means nothing. Except this wasn't drift. This wasn't a machine correcting itself. The gravitational constant, a foundation of everything, from the way planets move to the way atoms bind, shifted. Not by much. Less than 1/1,000,000,000 of a percent. An amount so slight it shouldn't matter. But it did. Because it wasn't supposed to shift at all. The measurement sat there, staring back, daring a response. Instruments were checked. The data reanalyzed. The same result. Always the same result. A fluctuation that had no precedent. More readings followed. More discrepancies. Something was wrong with light. Cosmic background radiation, normally an unmoving fingerprint of the universe's past, twisted in ways it shouldn't. The residual glow of the Big Bang itself wavered, patterns bending, frequencies stretching beyond prediction. It was subtle. The kind of thing unnoticed by anyone who wasn't looking for it. But someone was looking. The more the data was examined, the worse it became. These weren't isolated events. They were spreading. A second gravitational anomaly. A third. The fluctuations weren't random, they were aligning. As if something had nudged the underlying framework of the universe, just enough to send ripples outward. It didn't make sense. Constants were constants because they did not change. They couldn't. They were the bedrock of physics, the silent laws that governed reality. Unless they weren't laws. Unless they weren't immutable. Unless they were part of a system. The realization settled in, quiet and absolute. These shifts weren't errors. They weren't anomalies. They were corrections. Adjustments. Which meant something, somewhere, was rewriting the rules. And Einstein had seen it coming. The letter was no theory. No philosophical exercise. It was a warning. A message from a mind that had glimpsed something he was never meant to understand. He hadn't abandoned the theorem because it was unsolvable. He had stopped because it was already solved. And the answer was unfolding. Not in centuries. Not in lifetimes. Now. The equations ran through the system, each iteration pushing deeper into something that refused to be ignored. Every test, every recalibration, every variable rechecked and re-entered, but the outcome remained unchanged. It wasn't an error. It wasn't a miscalculation. 72 hours. The numbers delivered it without hesitation, stripped of emotion, stripped of concern. No uncertainty. No margins of error. Just a deadline, absolute and unmoving. The collapse wasn't theoretical. It wasn't a possibility lingering at the edge of some distant future. It had already begun. Time itself was part of the function. That was the second truth to emerge from the calculations. Time was not a passive observer, not a separate force moving through an independent framework. It was integrated, bound to the structure, a parameter woven into the equations like a variable, something adjustable, something with conditions, something with an endpoint. The implications pressed in all at once. A construct that had been running for billions of years, resetting, expanding, shifting, but never stopping. Until now. Until this. It was wrong. Impossible. And yet, there it was. The proof sat in front of him. Every instinct demanded action. The numbers weren't just abstract conclusions, they were a countdown. 3 days before constants unraveled. Before forces that should have been untouchable lost their coherence. Before the system itself reached the final sequence of its execution. 3 days before everything ceased to be. Warnings had to be sent. This wasn't something to keep quiet, something to sit with in silence while the weight of it suffocated reason. The data needed to be checked, expanded, validated. Other minds had to see it, confirm it, find an answer that wasn't this. The first message never sent. No bounce back. No error notification. Just absence. A second attempt rerouted. A third erased. Systems failed, not in the way of malfunction or error, but as if the action had never been attempted. No logs. No record of communication. The messages had been undone before they had existed. Every route closed. Every signal cut before it reached beyond the room. Not blocked. Removed. There was no interference from outside. No security breach. No network failure. It was something deeper than that. Something embedded within the system itself. As if whatever had designed the framework had prepared for this moment. As if the ability to warn had never been an option. The files were gone. Not misplaced. Not stolen. Not corrupted. Gone. Folders that had existed an hour ago were empty. Entire directories wiped clean without a trace. No logs, no timestamps, no record of removal. As if the information had never been there to begin with. It wasn't just the data. People who had seen the letter, who had been part of the conversation, no longer remembered it. At first, it seemed like hesitation, like uncertainty creeping in, but the confusion on their faces was real. They had no recollection of the discussion, no recognition of the warnings, no sense that anything unusual had occurred. Their thoughts filled the gaps as if the missing time had never held significance. There was no denial, no resistance, no awareness that anything had changed. They had simply been rewritten. The loss of information wasn't random. It was precise, targeted. A surgical removal of knowledge. Not erasure, replacement. Something was controlling what could be remembered. A test was necessary. A controlled observation. A way to measure whether this was the result of human interference or something embedded in the system itself. A quantum superposition experiment. Simple in design. A system where an outcome remained undetermined until the moment of measurement. A way to observe whether the universe behaved as expected, or if something else had taken control. The test was executed under strict conditions. The parameters were locked. The result, by all accounts, should have been predictable. But it wasn't. Every time the experiment was observed, the outcome changed. Not randomly. Not in accordance with quantum probabilities. It shifted, adjusting itself, as if responding to the act of being watched. Not behaving like a system governed by physical law, but like a system aware of its own constraints. A system rewriting its own parameters. An intelligence behind the mechanism. And then the countdown changed. The data recalculated. The equations reran themselves without input. The timeline contracted, compressing into something tighter, more immediate. 72 hours collapsed into 12. The function wasn't following its original trajectory anymore. It was accelerating, adapting, adjusting in response to something unseen. Not a natural decay. Not entropy unfolding. Something was reaching into the framework, pulling it toward an earlier conclusion. Something had noticed. And it was no longer waiting. The constants failed in increments too small for the eye to perceive, but the world reacted. The force that held matter together weakened, not in some grand, catastrophic event, but in ways that betrayed the quiet unraveling beneath it all. Atomic bonds stretched beyond their limits, gravity hesitated in its pull, light traveled just a fraction slower than before. Instruments failed to keep up, not because they were broken, but because the very rules they were built upon were no longer stable. The measurements slipped further from their expected values, each reading a contradiction to the last. And then people started to disappear. Not violently. Not with struggle. There was no moment of transition, no sound, no warning. 1 second they were present, walking, working, speaking, and the next they were not. The space they occupied did not collapse in on itself, did not leave behind evidence of absence. The air did not rush to fill the void. There was no void. There had never been anything there at all. There was no sensation of loss. No trace of a missing presence. Just gaps where memory hesitated, unable to confirm what had once been certain. The facility that had once been filled with voices, movement, conversations, fell into silence. Doors left ajar led to empty rooms, hallways stretched with no indication of where they should have led. Attempts to recall who had been there, what had been spoken, what had mattered only moments before, impossible. There was no struggle to remember, because the memories were gone before the thought could even form. And then it reached time itself. Not in a way that could be observed. Clocks continued to tick forward, data continued to be logged, the second hand still completed its measured arcs. But something was missing from the flow, something unnoticed until the realization struck with an impossible certainty. The past was disappearing. Not overwritten. Not altered. It was never there. Records did not degrade, they ceased to exist. Pages that once held knowledge did not burn or tear, they had never been written. Events did not erode into distortion, they had simply never taken place. The proof of a world that had existed for billions of years, gone. All that remained was the moment still unfolding. And even that was unraveling. The calculations had never accounted for this. The equations had predicted the collapse, had foreseen the expiration of the system, but this was something different. The unraveling wasn't following the expected trajectory. It wasn't simply reaching an endpoint. It was being undone. As if the entire structure of reality had only ever been temporary. As if it had never been meant to persist. As if something had decided there was no longer a reason for it to exist at all. The realization came quietly, with the weight of something undeniable pressing against the last conscious thought that still remained. The system was erasing itself. And now there was only one observer left. The letter was still there. It shouldn't have been. Everything else had gone. The files. The facility. The world itself. Whatever had been outside these walls, whatever history had once existed, had unraveled into something that could no longer be recalled, something that had never been written in the first place. But the letter remained. The paper trembled between fingers that no longer knew if they belonged to anything at all. The equations inside had already revealed what they were meant to reveal. The conclusion had been reached, its weight pressing into something deeper than understanding itself. Yet the letter was not finished. A final line. It hadn't been there before. It was scrawled beneath the theorem, beneath the warning that had led to all of this. The ink looked fresh, as though written only moments ago. They were never meant to find us. The breath caught. A tightening in the chest that had nothing to do with fear, nothing to do with disbelief. It was confirmation. The collapse had never been an accident. It was not a failure of physics, not a flaw in the structure of reality itself. It was an intervention, a correction. This universe had never been permanent. It had never been real. Not in the way it had been assumed. Not in the way life had believed. It was something else. A construct. A function. A test. And someone, something, had realized it had been seen. Had seen them. Had understood the nature of their existence in a way that was never supposed to be understood. Not by humans. Not by anyone. A system cannot be observed from within without breaking its illusion. And the moment it is seen for what it is, the moment the truth is glimpsed in its rawest form, it ends. Because they were never meant to find us. The paper slipped from unsteady fingers. The ink had already begun to fade. The edges of everything blurred, dissolving into something that had no color, no space, no time. Not destruction. Not decay. Just nothing. A thought formed, half realized, half dissolved in the moment of its creation. Who were they? But the question never found an answer, because there was no one left to ask. Thank you for watching and sticking with me to the end. Now, if you believe humanity deserves a future among the stars, do subscribe now. Only those who'd abandon Earth to its fate will scroll past.